Wind was a hungry thing, tearing at the thin linen of her shift and screaming promises of the abyss below. It clawed at her hair, whipping strands of pale blonde across her face like frantic ghosts. Beneath the weight of the blood moon, the granite cliffs of Blackwood Point glowed with a malevolent crimson light, painting the world in shades of rust and ruin. This was the place of endings, where traitors and the tainted were given back to the unforgiving sea. Tonight, that meant her, Arwen Hale, the Omega who had dared to say no. Her silence was the only shield she had left, a fragile thing against the snarling beast of the pack behind her. They waited for her to break, to weep, to beg, but the only sound she would give this night was the one her body made when it met the rocks. That was a promise. Behind her, the Blackwood pack was a restless sea of shadows and glowing eyes. 50 wolves, bound by blood and brutality, had gathered to witness her punishment. Their collective scent was a suffocating mix of damp fur, pine, and the sharp metallic tang of bloodlust. It coiled in her throat, a prelude to the death they had decreed. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight on her shoulders, heavier than the shame they had branded into her skin. The brand on the inside of her left wrist throbbed with a phantom heat. An Omega's sigil, stark and black, twisted into a mark of deviancy. It declared her broken, defiant, unworthy. It was the price for refusing Marcus Thorne, the pack's favored beta and the mate their alpha had chosen for her. Marcus, with his cruel smile and hands that knew only how to take, had expected her to submit with the silent gratitude of a lesser wolf. He had expected her to be a vessel for his heirs, a warm body in his bed, a footnote in his legacy. But Arwen's wolf, the spirit that should have answered the call of her pack, had been silent since birth. She was wolfless, mute, a flaw in the bloodline. And in that silent human heart, a single word had taken root. No, she hadn't spoken it. She couldn't. When Marcus had cornered her by the river, his scent thick with possessive intent, she had simply met his gaze and shaken her head. When he'd grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, she had not cried out. She had fought, not with the claws and teeth of a shifter, but with the desperate, feral strength of a cornered human. She had scratched his face, drawing blood, and shoved him into the icy water before he could pin her. That act of defiance had sealed her fate. An Omega did not refuse a beta. A wolfless female did not injure a warrior. Her silence was mistaken for arrogance, her fear for contempt. Alpha Gregor had made the proclamation before the entire pack, his voice a gravelly boom that echoed her sentence off the ancient stones of their meeting hall. For defying the will of the pack, for raising a hand against your intended, Arwen Hale is condemned. The blood moon will claim her. Now that moon hung directly overhead, a lurid, weeping eye in the black velvet sky. Its light seemed to magnify every flaw, every fear. It illuminated the triumphant sneer on Marcus's face as he stood at the forefront of the pack, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The scratches she'd given him had healed, but he touched the spot on his cheek as if they were a war trophy. Alpha Gregor stepped forward, his massive form eclipsing the moon for a moment. He was all grizzled fur and cold authority, a leader whose rule was absolute. Arwen Hale, he growled, the sound vibrating through the rock beneath her bare feet. You were given a place, a purpose. You have rejected it. The pack has no room for broken things that will not serve. Her eyes remained fixed on the churning black water below. The waves crashed against the jagged rocks with a sound like thunder, sending sprays of cold mist up to kiss her skin. It was a terrifying symphony, but it was better than the symphony of growls behind her. That was the sound of hatred. The ocean at least was indifferent. Its violence was pure, without malice. You have one final chance to repent, the Alpha said, though his tone held no offer of mercy. It was a formality, a last twist of the knife. Beg for the pack's forgiveness. Accept your union with Marcus Thorne, and your life will be spared. A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd. This was the true spectacle. Not the death, but the breaking. They wanted to see her crawl. They wanted to hear her beg, even if the sounds were just choked, pathetic whimpers from a mute throat. Arwen slowly turned her head, not to look at the Alpha, but at Marcus. His eyes gleamed with a possessive, predatory light. He thought he had won. He believed that faced with the finality of the cliff's edge, she would choose him. He believed that any life, even one of servitude and misery at his side, was better than no life at all. He was wrong. She held his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt a surge of something that was not fear or shame, but pure, unadulterated power. It was the power of choice. They had taken everything from her, her voice, her standing, her future, but they could not take this. This last defiant act was hers, and hers alone. She would not be pushed. She would not be thrown. She would leap. A small, sad smile touched her lips. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but it was genuine, and it infuriated Marcus more than any scream could have. His face contorted in a snarl of rage. "Insolent bitch!" he roared, taking a step forward. "You would rather die than accept me?" Arwen simply turned back to the sea, her smile fading as she took a deep, shuddering breath of the salt-laced air. It tasted of freedom. The Alpha's patience snapped. "So be it, Marcus, enforce the pack's judgment." The sound of his heavy boots on the rock was the final countdown. Arwen closed her eyes. She thought of her mother, long dead, who used to hum lullabies into her hair. She thought of the sun on her face in the brief, stolen moments of peace she had known. She would carry those memories into the darkness with her. Marcus's hot, stale breath was on the back of her neck. His hand reached for her shoulder to spin her around, to force her to look at him as he sent her to her death. But she was faster. With a strength born of final desperation, she took one step back, launching herself off the edge of the world. For a breathtaking second, there was no falling, only suspension. The wind held her, a deafening roar in her ears, and the crimson moon filled her vision. The faces of her pack, contorted in shock and rage, shrank away above her. She had stolen their kill. She had won. Then gravity claimed her. The world became a blur of black rock and white foam. The scream that had been trapped inside her for 20 years finally broke free, not as a sound, but as a feeling. A silent, wrenching release that tore through her soul. This was it, the fall, the end. She braced for the shattering impact, for the cold shock of the water, for the final, merciful blackness. It never came. Instead, something hit her, hard. It wasn't the jagged cruelty of rock, but something solid, unyielding, and impossibly warm. The breath was knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. The dizzying spin stopped, her descent arrested with a jarring force that rattled her bones. Confusion, thick and suffocating, clouded her mind. Strong arms were wrapped around her waist and legs, caging her against a chest as hard as ancient stone. The air smelled different here, miles above the thrashing sea. The scent of pine and bloodlust was gone, replaced by something elemental and overwhelming. The smell of a gathering storm, of lightning striking damp earth, of sovereign power. A low growl rumbled against her ear, a sound so deep it vibrated through her entire being, resonating in a place that had always been empty. It was not a growl of the Blackwood Pack. It was older, darker, steeped in a raw authority that made Alpha Gregor's power feel like a child's tantrum. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. She was being held, pinned against a powerful body, sideways in the air. Below her, the waves still crashed, 100 feet down. Above, the cliff edge was a distant, receding line. They were still falling, but slower, as if something were defying gravity itself. She craned her neck, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs. She saw a chiseled jawline, dark with stubble, and a glimpse of a throat corded with muscle. His scent filled her senses, primal and possessive, a scent that screamed alpha in a way she had never known. It was the scent of a king. A voice deeper than the growl spoke a single word near her ear. It was not a question or a statement, but a claim, a declaration that shattered her entire world far more completely than the rocks below ever could have. Mine. The fall did not end, it merely changed. Instead of the chaotic, terrifying plummet, it became a controlled, impossibly slow descent. The man holding her was the anchor in the storm of her senses, his body a bulwark against the shrieking wind. Arwen's mind, still reeling from the shock of being snatched from the jaws of death, struggled to make sense of the new reality. The scent of him was overwhelming, a wild, clean fragrance of petrichor and ozone, as if he had been born from the heart of a thunderstorm. It was nothing like the stifling, musky scents of the Blackwood shifters. This was the scent of command, of vast, open territories and unchallenged dominion. They landed on a narrow, pebbled beach at the base of the cliffs, a place the tide had not yet reclaimed. The landing was so soft, so preternaturally graceful, it felt less like an impact and more like an arrival. For a moment, he did not release her, holding her suspended against his chest. His heartbeat was a slow, powerful drum against her back, a rhythm of absolute calm that was a stark contrast to the frantic terror seizing her own. Above them, on the cliff's edge, she could hear the enraged howls of the Blackwood pack. They sounded distant, tinny, like the cries of lesser beasts, their fury rendered impotent by the sheer impossibility of what they had just witnessed. Finally, with a deliberation that felt both intimate and threatening, he set her on her feet. Her legs, weak and trembling, threatened to buckle. She stumbled, and a large hand shot out, steadying her by the elbow. The touch was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt of heat through her veins that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a raw, primal awareness. He stepped back, allowing her the space to see him, and the breath she'd just regained caught in her throat. The blood moon cast everything in a stark, unforgiving light, but it seemed to worship him, carving his features from shadow and crimson. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, broad-shouldered and lean, with the lethal grace of a predator. He was dressed in dark, worn leathers that made no sound as he moved. His hair was the color of midnight, long and untamed, pulled back from a face that was brutally handsome. It was a face built for war and rule. A faint silvery scar cut from his left temple down across his cheekbone, disappearing into the dark stubble along his jaw. It didn't mar his appearance, it sanctified it, a testament to a battle that had failed to kill him. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were not brown or black or blue. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an ancient, intelligent light. They held no pity, no kindness, only an intensity that stripped her bare, seeing past the mute Omega, past the wolfless girl, and into the terrified soul hiding within. He looked at her not as a person he had saved, but as a thing he had found. A curiosity, a possession. Mine. The word echoed in the hollows of her mind, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in her bones. What did it mean? He was not of her pack. He was a stranger, a myth. Whispers sometimes drifted across the borders, tales of the Alpha King who ruled the vast, untamed Shadowlands to the north. A king who had united the warring clans, whose ferocity was legendary, and whose justice was swift and final. They called him Draven, King Lucian Draven. The name was a curse on the lips of the Blackwood elders, a name spoken to frighten pups. And he was here. He had caught her. Why? The question was a silent scream in her head. Why would a king concern himself with the death of a disgraced Omega from a rival pack? He should have let her fall. He should have watched her break upon the rocks and thought nothing of it. It was not his concern. His golden gaze dropped from her face to her left arm. Before she could react, he closed the distance between them in a single silent step. His fingers, calloused and strong, wrapped around her wrist. He turned it over, exposing the brand to the moonlight. The ugly, twisted Omega sigil seemed to writhe under his scrutiny. Arwen flinched, expecting the disgust, the contempt she always received when anyone saw it. His reaction was not what she expected. A low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest, the sound of shifting tectonic plates. His thumb traced the edge of the brand, a touch that was surprisingly gentle, yet his eyes held a terrifying darkness. It was not disgust, it was fury. A cold, controlled rage that seemed directed not at her, but at the mark itself. He looked at it as if it were a personal insult. He finally released her wrist, but the ghost of his touch remained, a tingling heat that spread up her arm. He still hadn't spoken another word, his silence a far more potent weapon than the shouts and snarls she was used to. It unnerved her, leaving her no ground to stand on, no way to predict his intent. From the shadows of the sparse, wind-blasted trees that lined the beach, 2 more figures emerged. They moved with the same silent, deadly grace as their king, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. They were his warriors, his Beta and Gamma, their scents sharp and alert, blending with the storm scent of their Alpha. They flanked him, their gazes fixed on her with a predatory curiosity, but they did not approach. They waited for his command. Alpha, the taller of the two, said, his voice a respectful rasp. The blackwood curs are still howling on the cliffs. Your orders? King Lucian did not even glance up. His attention remained solely on Arwen, his golden eyes searching her face as if memorizing every line, every flicker of fear. Let them howl, he said, his voice deceptively calm. Their noise is meaningless. The casual dismissal of an entire pack of her alpha sent a tremor of shock through Arwen. Alpha Gregor's authority was the sun her world had revolved around. To this king, he was nothing more than a yapping dog. The king's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, an almost imperceptible shift. You are trembling, he stated. It was not a question. She was. The adrenaline that had fueled her leap was draining away, leaving behind a deep, bone-aching cold and a violent shuddering she couldn't control. The thin shift she wore was useless against the wind off the sea. Without a word, he began to unfasten the heavy cloak from his own shoulders. It was made of some dark, thick fur, lined with black wool. As he moved, the moonlight caught on something around his neck, a chain of tarnished silver, holding a single jagged piece of obsidian. He draped the cloak over her shoulders. The weight of it was immense, grounding. It enveloped her in an immediate, shocking warmth, saturated with his potent, overwhelming scent. It was like being wrapped in the heart of the storm itself. The primal part of her, the part that had no voice and no wolf, instinctively craved the security of it. It was a shelter, a shield. But it was also a cage, marking her with his scent, claiming her in a way that was more profound than any spoken word. She clutched the edges of the heavy fur, her knuckles white. This was wrong, all of it. She had chosen death. A clean, final ending. This was something else. A darker, more uncertain path. We are leaving, Wushuan, Lucian announced to his men, his voice leaving no room for argument. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Arwen's shock. Leaving? To where? The Shadowlands? The dark, foreboding realm of myth and fear? No, she could not. She would be an outsider, a branded Omega from an enemy pack. Her life there would be a different kind of death sentence. Summoning the last vestiges of her defiance, the same fire that had made her leap, she took a shaky step backward. She shook her head, her eyes wide with desperate pleading. It was the only way she could communicate her refusal. No, leave me here, let me go. The king watched her silent protest, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something akin to admiration in his golden eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. You have no say in the matter, he said, his voice soft but laced with unyielding steel. Your choice was the cliff. Everything after that is mine. He moved before she could retreat further. One powerful arm swept behind her knees, the other around her back, and he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. A small, helpless cry, a soundless puff of air, escaped her lips. He held her securely against his chest, the heavy fur of the cloak cocooning them both. Her cheek was pressed against the cold leather of his tunic, and she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart once more. He turned his back on the cliffs, on the frenzied howls of her past, and began to walk into the darkness of the forest that bordered his lands. His warriors fell into step behind them, their presence a silent, menacing promise of his power. Arwen twisted in his arms, looking back one last time. She could see the silhouette of Marcus Thorne on the cliff's edge, shaking his fist at the empty air. The sight filled her not with fear, but with a strange, hollow emptiness. That life was over. The brand on her wrist no longer throbbed with shame, but with the chilling realization of her new reality. She had leapt from the cliff to escape a cage, and she had fallen directly into the arms of a king who had just forged a new one around her, one made of shadow, storm, and a terrifying, possessive claim. He was not taking her to safety. He was taking her to his territory. And as the shadows of his forest swallowed them whole, Arwen knew she hadn't escaped the fall at all. She had only changed its direction. The journey was a silent, fluid passage through a world of shadows. Cradled in the king's arms, Arwen felt the rhythmic power of his stride, a steady, ground-devouring pace that spoke of tireless strength. The forest of the Shadowlands was nothing like the familiar woods of her home. The trees here were different, ancient, gnarled behemoths that seemed to drink the moonlight, their dense canopies creating a ceiling of near-perfect darkness. The air was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth, rich moss, and something else. a faint electric hum like the air after a lightning strike. It was the scent of raw, untamed magic. No one spoke. The king's 2 warriors moved behind them like ghosts, their footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet of fallen leaves. It was an unnerving, disciplined silence that was a world away from the constant growls, snaps, and boisterous challenges of the Blackwood pack. Here, power was not proclaimed. It simply was. It saturated the very air they breathed. Arwen kept her eyes closed for most of the journey, a futile attempt to block out the terrifying new reality. But she couldn't block out the sensations, the solid wall of his chest against her back, the steady hypnotic rhythm of his heart, the overwhelming scent of him that clung to the fur of his cloak, a scent that was seeping into her skin, marking her in a way far more indelible than the brand on her wrist. A terrifying, traitorous part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, found a strange comfort in the unyielding strength of his hold. She had spent her entire life feeling fragile, disposable. For these few stolen moments, wrapped in his power, she felt anchored. The thought horrified her, and she pushed it away, focusing instead on the cold knot of fear in her stomach. After what felt like an eternity, the texture of the air changed. The dense smell of the forest thinned, replaced by the scent of cold stone, wood smoke, and something else. The collective living scent of a massive hidden pack. Arwen's eyes snapped open. They had emerged from the tree line into a vast, moon-drenched clearing. Before them, rising against the night sky like a jagged mountain of its own, was a fortress. It wasn't built of wood and earth like the Blackwood hold, but hewn from the dark granite bones of the land itself. Towers pierced the clouds, their crenellations like the teeth of some great beast. There were no welcoming lights in the arrow-slit windows, only an imposing, impenetrable darkness. It was a place of absolute strength, a declaration of power meant to crush the spirits of enemies and awe its subjects into submission. It was a king's seat. It was a prison. Lucian didn't slow his pace. As they approached the massive, iron-banded gates, they swung inward without a sound, moved by unseen hands. Guards, clad in dark leather and steel, stood within the torchlit entryway. They were larger than the Blackwood warriors, their faces harder, their eyes holding a disciplined stillness. As the king passed, they did not speak or cheer. They simply lowered their heads and placed a fist over their hearts in a gesture of silent, unwavering fealty. Their eyes, all shades of gold, amber, and gray, flickered to Arwen. Their expressions a mixture of shock and intense curiosity, but none dared to question their alpha's burden. The king carried her through vast, echoing halls. The air inside was cool and clean, smelling of beeswax, drying herbs, and ancient stone. Torches in iron sconces cast long, dancing shadows, revealing walls hung with old, faded tapestries depicting great hunts and forgotten battles. It was a place steeped in history, in generations of power. It made the Blackwood hold feel like a temporary, savage camp. He didn't take her to a dungeon or a cell, as she had expected. Instead, he climbed a wide, winding staircase, his steps sure and silent on the worn stone. He stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open with his shoulder. The room he carried her into stole the breath from her lungs. A fire was already crackling in a stone hearth the size of a man, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. The floor was covered in thick, woven rugs of deep crimson and black. A large bed, piled high with fur blankets and soft linen pillows, dominated the far wall. There was a carved wooden table, a wardrobe, and even a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher. It was a room fit for a queen, filled with a rustic luxury she couldn't have imagined. It was more comfortable, more opulent than Alpha Gregor's own chambers. And it terrified her more than any dungeon could have. Lucian finally set her down, his movements as fluid and controlled as ever. She stood on one of the thick rugs, her bare feet sinking into the plush wool. The heavy cloak slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet like a shadow. Without its weight and warmth, she felt exposed, small, and utterly out of place. The simple, torn linen shift she wore was a stark reminder of her status as a broken omega in a king's private chambers. He watched her for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the firelight. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He saw the way she stood, poised for flight, her body radiating a fear so profound it was almost a tangible thing. He saw the way her gaze darted from the door to the window, already searching for an escape that did not exist. When he finally moved, it was not toward her, but to the fireplace. He picked up an iron poker and nudged a log, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up the chimney. The simple domestic act was so at odds with the terrifying mythic figure who had plucked her from the sky that it left her reeling. "You are injured." His voice was low, a statement of fact. Arwen frowned in confusion. She didn't feel any pain beyond the deep, aching bruises that were beginning to form from the force of his catch. She instinctively looked down at herself. On the top of her right foot, just below her ankle, was a long, shallow gash. Blood, dark in the firelight, had tracked a path down her skin. She must have cut it on the sharp pebbles of the beach when he had first set her down. She hadn't even noticed. Before she could process it, he was moving again. He went to the washstand, poured water from the pitcher into the basin, and retrieved a clean linen cloth. He brought them over and knelt, not on one knee like a supplicant. He simply folded his powerful frame down to her level, an act of such unexpected humility, it short-circuited her fear, replacing it with sheer, dumbfounded shock. A king did not kneel, not for anyone, especially not for a worthless branded Omega. He gestured toward a small wooden stool near the fire. His eyes commanded her to sit. Her legs, still trembling, obeyed without conscious thought. She sank onto the stool, watching him as if he were a phantom. He gently took her foot in his hand. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip firm but not painful. The sheer size of his hand dwarfed her ankle. He dipped the cloth into the cool water and began to clean the wound. The first touch of the wet cloth made her flinch, a sharp hiss of air escaping her teeth. The cut stung, the salt from the sea spray making it worse. "Be still," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to travel up her leg. He didn't look up, his focus entirely on the task. His touch became even more gentle, his movements precise and methodical as he carefully washed away the blood and grime. Arwen's heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. This was an act of impossible intimacy. No one had touched her with such care in her entire life. Touches in her life were for punishment, for control, for lust. They were the rough shoves from other pack members, the bruising grip of Marcus Thorne, the stinging slap of the alpha's mate for a perceived slight. They were never, ever gentle. She watched the way the firelight played over his dark hair, the focused intensity in his golden eyes, the subtle flex of the muscles in his forearm as he worked. His scent enveloped her, no longer just a threat, but a complex tapestry of storm, earth, and something uniquely, personally him. A clean, masculine scent that was both wild and civilized. Her fear began to war with a new, deeply unsettling emotion. It was a strange, fluttering warmth that started in her chest and spread outward. It wasn't gratitude, not exactly. It was a terrifying, bewildering sense of being seen. He wasn't tending to a broken Omega. He was tending to her. When he finished, he examined the clean cut. "It is not deep. It will heal." He released her foot, and the loss of his warmth was a sudden, sharp chill. He stood, his full, intimidating height once more creating a chasm between them. The moment of connection, of strange equality, was gone. He was the king again. She was the captive. He walked to the large wardrobe and pulled out a simple, dark-colored nightdress of soft, thick cotton. It was clean and plain, but far finer than anything she had ever owned. He laid it on the edge of the bed. "Rest," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for refusal. He turned to leave, and a fresh wave of panic seized her. To be left alone in this vast, strange room was almost as terrifying as his presence had been. She didn't know the rules here. She didn't know what would happen when the sun rose. She stood up, taking a half step toward him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. A desperate, silent plea was in her eyes. "What do you want from me? Why did you save me?" He paused at the door, his back to her. He seemed to sense her unspoken questions. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he spoke, his voice low and carrying a weight that settled in her bones. "The Blackwood Pack branded you for defiance," he said, his voice laced with a cold, controlled anger. "They cast you out for having the courage to make a choice. Here, your choices are gone." He turned his head just enough for her to see his profile, his golden eye burning in the shadows. "You belong to me now, Arwen Hale. Sleep in my fortress, breathe my air, and heal. But do not for a second believe you are free." With that, he stepped out of the room, pulling the heavy oak door closed behind him. There was no sound of a lock, no turning of a key. There didn't need to be. The finality in his words was a stronger cage than any iron bar. She was alone, left with the crackling fire, the ghost of his gentle touch on her skin, and the chilling echo of his claim on her soul. Arwen awoke to a world of impossible softness. For a confused, disoriented moment, she thought she must be dead, for this could not be life. Life was a thin, scratchy straw pallet in a communal Omega dwelling, the constant chill seeping up from the packed earth floor, and the sour smell of fear. This was different. This was the deep, yielding comfort of a feather mattress, the whisper of fine-spun linen against her skin, and the weighty warmth of a fur blanket. A low, contented fire crackled in the hearth, chasing the shadows from the corners of the stone room and painting the ceiling in a gentle, flickering gold. Reality crashed back in a suffocating wave. The king's room, the fortress, the fall. She wasn't dead. She was a captive. She sat up with a jolt, the heavy furs pooling around her waist. She was wearing the soft cotton nightdress he had left for her. Its unfamiliar texture was a constant, intimate reminder of where she was, of whose mercy she was under. Her gaze darted around the room, cataloging every detail with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. The heavy oak door, unlocked but impassable. The tall, narrow window, glazed with thick, imperfect panes of glass that distorted the world outside into a swirl of gray morning mist and dark green forest. There was no escape. Her foot where he had tended the wound gave a dull throb. She drew her knee up, examining it. The cut was clean, the skin around it still slightly pink. It was covered with a thin, almost invisible layer of a fragrant, waxy salve that smelled of pine sap and yarrow. He had done that too. This king of shadows, this terrifying, mythic alpha, had not only saved her life, but had tended to her like she was something precious. The contradiction was a knot in her stomach. Kindness from an enemy was a weapon she didn't know how to defend against. Brutality she understood. Contempt was familiar. This careful, deliberate care was a form of psychological warfare. It was meant to unbalance her, to make her grateful, to make her compliant. A fierce, protective anger surged through her, the same defiance that had carried her to the cliff's edge. She would not be broken by cruelty, and she would not be seduced by comfort. She slid from the bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush rug. The fire's warmth was a welcome relief against the morning chill, but she resisted the urge to huddle closer to it. She would not accept its comfort either. On the wooden table, a simple meal had been left for her. A bowl of hot, steaming porridge with berries, a thick slice of dark bread with a crock of butter, and a mug of what smelled like mulled cider. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She hadn't eaten since the morning of her sentencing. But to eat his food was to accept his provision, to acknowledge his ownership. The heavy door creaked open, and Arwen spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It wasn't the king, it was a woman, old and severe, her gray hair pulled back in a tight, unforgiving bun. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes the color of slate chips, sharp and assessing. She carried a pitcher of fresh water and clean linens. Her scent was faint, smelling of soap, herbs, and old loyalty. She was no warrior, but she radiated an authority of her own. The woman's gaze swept over Arwen, taking in the borrowed nightdress, the wild tangle of her pale hair, the defiant set of her jaw. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the untouched food, and a flicker of something, disapproval perhaps, or understanding, crossed her features. She said nothing. She moved with an efficient, silent grace, replacing the water on the washstand, adding a fresh log to the fire. Her silence was different from Arwen's. Hers was a choice, a discipline. It was the silence of one who has seen everything and has no need to comment on it. Arwen stood frozen, a statue of wary tension. In the Blackwood pack, a servant would not have dared to look her in the eye. They would have scurried, heads down, avoiding the tainted presence of a disgraced Omega. This woman's gaze was direct, unwavering. It was not unkind, but it was not friendly. It was neutral. She was observing a new, strange element that had been introduced into her king's life. When her tasks were done, the woman paused by the table. She tapped a single bony finger on the rim of the porridge bowl. Then she looked at Arwen, a clear, unspoken command in her eyes. Eat. With a final, lingering look, she turned and left, closing the door as softly as she had opened it. The silent command broke something in Arwen's resolve. It wasn't a threat. It was practical. It was sense. Starving herself would be a slow, foolish suicide, another death stolen from her. She needed strength, if only to endure. With a deep, shuddering breath of defeat, she sat at the table and began to eat. The porridge was warm and sweet, the bread dense and nourishing. It was the best food she had ever tasted, and every bite felt like a betrayal of the girl who had chosen to leap. Later, she found clothes laid out for her in the wardrobe. Not silks and velvets, but simple, practical garments of a quality she had never known. A soft wool tunic the color of moss, dark leggings, and supple leather slippers. They fit as if they had been made for her. The discovery sent a fresh chill of unease down her spine. It implied foresight. It implied he had known he would be bringing her here. Dressed, she felt marginally more human, less like a sacrificial offering. She went to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool, distorted glass. The mist had begun to burn off, revealing the sheer, staggering scale of the king's domain. The fortress was built high on a spur of rock, overlooking a vast, dark sea of forest that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the silver thread of a river and the distant, jagged peaks of mountains. There were no other keeps, no towns, no sign of civilization. Only the wild, untamed land, his land. The sheer impossibility of escape settled into her bones, a cold, heavy certainty. She spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended dread, waiting. Every footstep in the hall outside her door made her flinch. Every distant howl from the pack below made her skin crawl. The old woman returned with a midday meal and took the old dishes away, again in complete silence. The solitude was a torment, giving her too much time to think, to remember the feeling of the wind in her hair as she fell, the shocking, solid impact of his body, the possessive rumble of his voice. The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple when he finally came. The door opened without a sound, and he was simply there, filling the frame, bringing the scent of the cold evening air and the wildness of the forest with him. He had changed from his leathers into a simple dark tunic and trousers, similar to what she wore. It made him seem less like a king and more like a man, which was somehow even more terrifying. His dark hair was damp, as if he had just come from washing, and the silver scar on his cheek seemed more prominent in the fading light. His golden eyes found her immediately. She was standing by the window, and she straightened her spine, refusing to cower. She would meet this fate on her feet. He didn't speak. He closed the door and moved to the table, where the evening meal had already been left. He sat, not in the grand chair by the fire, but on the simple stool she had used that morning. He gestured to the other stool, a silent invitation, a command. Her feet felt like lead, but she forced them to move. She sat opposite him, the small table the only barrier between them. He began to eat, his movements economical and precise. Arwen stared down at her own plate, her appetite gone, her entire body a tightly coiled spring of anxiety. "The woman who attends you is named Elspeth," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "She is mute, not by birth, like you, by choice. Her mate was killed in the Unification Wars. She has not spoken a word since." Arwen's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Mute by choice? The concept was so alien, so powerful, it stunned her. To have a voice and choose to silence it? It was a form of strength she couldn't comprehend. Was that why he had assigned the woman to her? As a message? Lucian met her gaze, his own eyes unreadable. Here, silence is not seen as a weakness. It is seen as a discipline. He took a sip of water, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know what they called you. Branded Omega. Wolfless. Broken." He said the words without inflection, stripping them of their power to wound. They were simply facts. "They are fools. They see a flaw. I see a survivor." He set his cup down with a soft click. His gaze dropped to her wrist, which she had instinctively hidden in her lap. "Let me see it." A cold dread washed over her. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion. The brand was her shame, the ugly, permanent mark of her defiance and her pack's cruelty. She did not want him to see it again, to analyze it in the warm light of the fire. "Arwen," he said, and the sound of her own name on his lips was a physical touch. It was the first time he had used it. "Do not make me command you." The threat was quiet, but it hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. Slowly, reluctantly, she extended her left arm, placing her hand palm up on the table. The twisted sigil was a black stain against her pale skin, ugly and hateful. He leaned forward. He didn't touch her, not yet. He simply looked at the brand, and the air in the room grew thick, charged with that same cold fury she had sensed on the beach. His jaw tightened, and the muscles in his neck corded. "A mark of shame," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "They marked you like cattle for daring to have a will of your own." He lifted his right hand and lightly traced the silver scar on his own cheek. "This was a gift from my uncle, the night I killed him and took this throne. He meant it as a mark of my betrayal, a reminder that I was a kinslayer." He looked back at her, his golden eyes burning with a light that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "I wear it as a mark of my strength, a reminder that I survived him, that I survived them all." Then he reached across the table. His fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against hers before gently closing around her wrist. His touch was not a restraint, but a connection. A current of pure heat shot up her arm, straight to her heart. With his other hand, he reached out, and his thumb, impossibly gentle, traced the raised, scarred lines of her brand. She flinched, a violent, full-body tremor, and tried to pull away, but his grip on her wrist was unyielding. "Do not," he whispered, his voice intense. "Do not fear it, and do not let it define you." His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic path over the mark, and the nature of the touch began to change. It was no longer just gentle. There was a possessiveness to it, a claiming. It felt as if he were trying to erase the old mark and sear a new one, his own, directly onto her soul. Her breath hitched, her mind reeling from the onslaught of sensation, the heat of his skin, the intensity of his gaze, the overwhelming power of his scent. "My wolf," he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a rough, primal sound that vibrated through the point of contact between their skin. "He howled when he saw you leap. Not in triumph, like those curs on the cliff. In recognition." He finally lifted his gaze from her wrist to her eyes, and what she saw there made the world stop turning. It was a raw, naked possessiveness, a fire that burned away the king and left only the alpha, the male, the beast. "He does not see a branded omega when he looks at you," Lucian breathed, his thumb coming to a rest directly in the center of the sigil. "He smells the wind and the salt and the absolute defiance of your choice. He calls you Altan. In the old tongue, it means sky fallen." His grip on her wrist tightened, a final, definitive claim. "And he says you are mine." His words hung in the air, more binding than any chain. "He says you are mine." They were a verdict and a vow, a sentence and a sacrament. Arwen's mind, which had been a whirlwind of fear and defiance, went utterly still. The roaring in her ears ceased. There was only the crackle of the fire, the solid warmth of his hand on her wrist, and the bottomless gold of his eyes. Altan, sky fallen. The name resonated in a place deeper than thought, a place of instinct she hadn't known she possessed. It was a name of power and poetry, so far removed from the demeaning label of Omega, that it felt like a remaking of her very soul. He didn't see her as broken. He saw her as something mythic, something elemental, something that belonged to him. The spell was broken by the frantic, desperate hammering of her own heart. This was madness. He was her captor, an enemy king. This strange, intense connection was a trick, a manipulation designed to ensure her submission. Her rational mind screamed at her to pull away, to fight, to show him the same defiance she had shown Marcus Thorne. But her body betrayed her. Her skin tingled where he touched her, a living current passing between them. Her wolf, the silent, absent spirit that had never answered her, felt like a hollow space being filled. For the first time in her life, she felt the echo of another's wolf, Lucian's wolf, calling into her own emptiness, and it was a terrifying, seductive song. She pulled her hand back, not with a jerk, but with a slow, deliberate motion that cost her every ounce of her willpower. He let her go. The loss of his touch was a physical ache, leaving her skin cold and her senses screaming. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold herself together. Lucian watched her, his expression unreadable. He leaned back on his stool, the moment of raw, primal intensity receding, replaced once more by the calm, controlled aura of the king. But the mask had slipped. She had seen the beast beneath the crown, and the knowledge was a dangerous, thrilling weight in her chest. "The blood moon is waning," he said, his voice even once more. "But its power still lingers. It makes the blood run hot. It stirs things that are best left sleeping." He stood, his large frame seeming to shrink the room. "Tomorrow I will show you the fortress. You will learn the shape of your new life." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and left, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click. Arwen did not sleep that night. She sat in the chair by the fire, wrapped in a fur blanket, staring into the flames. His words replayed in her mind, a relentless loop. "I see a survivor. He calls you Altan. You are mine." She was a paradox, a captive being treated with more reverence than she had ever known, a wolfless Omega being claimed by the most powerful Alpha she had ever met. The world no longer made sense. Her life, which had been a simple, brutal equation of submission or death, had become a complex, terrifying puzzle. The next morning, true to his word, he came for her. He was dressed again in practical leathers, his presence filling her chambers with a vital, restless energy. He said nothing, simply waiting by the door. Arwen, dressed in the moss-green tunic and leggings, followed him with a sense of dread and inevitability. He led her not through the grand, echoing halls, but down winding back staircases, and through narrower, torchlit corridors. It was a side of the fortress she hadn't seen, the working heart of the great stone beast. She caught glimpses of kitchens alive with the bustle of servants and the smell of roasting meat, of armories where warriors cleaned and sharpened steel, of forges where blacksmiths' hammers rang like brutal bells. The people they passed, warriors and servants alike, all reacted the same way. They would stop, their eyes widening first at the sight of their king, then widening further at the sight of the pale, strange woman trailing in his wake. A wave of whispers, growls, and speculative glances followed them like a physical tide. She could feel their curiosity, their suspicion, their awe. Who was she? Why was the king himself giving her a tour? Why was she wearing the colors of their clan? She could feel their wolves assessing her, sniffing at her scent, and finding it lacking. The emptiness where her own wolf should be was a void they could all sense. It made her a curiosity, an aberration. Lucian ignored them all. He moved through his fortress with an air of absolute ownership, the whispers and stares of his people no more concerning to him than the buzzing of flies. He showed her the library, a vast circular room lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of leather-bound books, the air thick with the scent of old paper and knowledge. He showed her the training grounds, a massive courtyard where shifters in their human and wolf forms sparred with a lethal, disciplined ferocity that made the Blackwood brawls look like pups' play. He led her to the battlements, high on the outer walls, where the wind tore at their clothes, and the whole of his vast, wild kingdom was laid out below them. "My ancestors built this fortress from the mountain's heart," he said, his voice deep and resonant against the rushing wind. He pointed to the north, toward the jagged, snow-capped peaks. "Beyond those mountains is the frozen waste. To the east," he gestured to the endless dark sea of the forest. "The Whisperwood, where old magic still sleeps. To the south is the river, the border with the Blackwood lands. And to the west, the sea." He looked down at her, his golden eyes sharp and intense. "This is my land. Everyone within its borders owes me their fealty. They are my pack, my responsibility, my strength." His meaning was clear. She was within his borders now. She too was his responsibility, his possession. The tour ended in a place that made Arwen's blood run cold. It was a garden, but unlike any she had ever seen. It was enclosed by high stone walls, open to the sky, and filled not with flowers, but with herbs. Hundreds of them, planted in neat, raised beds, their scents sharp and medicinal on the air. Wolfsbane, with its deadly purple flowers. Belladonna, hemlock. But there were others she recognized. Healing herbs like comfrey, yarrow, and willow bark. It was a place of both poison and remedy, of life and death. In the center of the garden stood a single ancient weirwood tree, its bark bone-white, its leaves the color of blood. A face, old and sorrowful, was carved into its trunk. It was a heart tree, a relic of the old ways that most packs had long since abandoned. "This is the Grove of Judgment," Lucian said, his voice softer here, more reverent. "When a member of my pack breaks a sacred law, they are brought here. They stand before the heart tree and speak their crime. The Alpha is the judge, but the magic of this place? It ensures the truth is spoken." Arwen stared at the sorrowful face in the tree, a shiver tracing a path down her spine. The air here felt thick, heavy with the weight of old confessions and final sentences. "What happens to them?" she whispered, the words escaping as a mere puff of air, the first sound she had made in his presence. She hadn't even realized she was going to speak. Lucian turned to her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the sound of her voice, however faint. "Justice is rendered," he said simply. "Sometimes it is a scourge, sometimes a banishment, sometimes a clean death." He took a step closer to her, his shadow falling over her. "I am a harsh king, Arwen, but I am a just one. I do not punish defiance. I punish betrayal. I do not condemn weakness. I condemn deception." His gaze bored into her, as if trying to see the truth of her soul. She felt a desperate urge to look away, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. She had no betrayals to confess, no deceptions to hide. Her only crime was survival. Suddenly, a commotion from outside the garden walls shattered the heavy silence. A sharp, urgent cry, followed by the sound of running feet and snarled commands. Lucian's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The calm, contemplative king vanished, replaced by the predator. A low growl rumbled in his chest, and his head snapped toward the entrance. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a blade of steel. He was gone before she could even think to disobey, moving with a speed that was not entirely human. Left alone in the Garden of Judgment, Arwen's heart hammered against her ribs. The shouts grew louder, tinged with a note of panic. She could hear the distinct, savage snarls of a wolf that was out of control. Her promise to stay lasted less than a minute. Curiosity and a deeper, more instinctual fear warred within her, and fear won. She crept to the arched stone entryway of the garden and peered out. The scene in the courtyard beyond was one of chaos. A group of Lucian's warriors had cornered a massive gray wolf, its fur matted with dirt and blood, its eyes rolling with feral madness. It was one of theirs. She could see the faint mark of the clan on its shoulder, but it was behaving like a rabid animal, snapping and lunging at the warriors who were trying to contain it with heavy nets. "It's the moon sickness, Alpha," one of the warriors shouted as Lucian strode onto the scene. "Corbin's youngest. He went on patrol this morning and came back like this. He's torn up 2 of the kennel guards." Lucian didn't hesitate. He walked toward the frenzied wolf, his movements calm and deliberate, a center of absolute authority in the storm of chaos. The other warriors fell back, giving him space. "Kale!" Lucian's voice was not a shout, but a low, powerful command that cut through the snarling. "Enough!" The wolf, Kale, paused in its lunging, its mad eyes fixing on its alpha. For a moment it seemed to recognize him. Its snarling lessened, a flicker of its sane self shining through the madness. Then its gaze shifted, moving past Lucian and fixed directly on Arwen, who was still half hidden in the garden's entryway. A new sound ripped from the wolf's throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a shriek of rage directed entirely at her. Outsider, enemy, Omega! The wolf's recognition of her inferior, enemy status overrode its loyalty to its alpha. With a final, blood-curdling howl, it ignored Lucian completely and launched itself directly at Arwen. It happened in a heartbeat. The warriors shouted in alarm. Arwen had no time to scream, no time to run. She was frozen, a deer caught in the path of a predator, death coming for her once again. But Lucian was faster than death. With a roar that shook the very stones of the fortress, he moved. He didn't shift, he didn't draw a weapon. He simply launched his body in a blur of motion, intercepting the rabid wolf midair. The impact was brutal. Man and beast crashed to the cobblestones in a tangled explosion of fury and fur. Lucian was on top, his hands clamped around the wolf's throat, his own face contorted in a mask of terrible, lethal rage. The king was gone. Only the alpha remained. His muscles strained, the tendons in his neck standing out like cords of steel as he fought to subdue the much larger wolf. Kale thrashed beneath him, its claws tearing at his arms, its teeth snapping inches from his face. Blood welled from a dozen new cuts on Lucian's skin, staining his tunic a dark crimson. He was going to kill it. With his bare hands, for daring to attack her. And in that moment, seeing his blood spill for her, a sound tore from Arwen's throat. A sound she had not made since she was a child. A sound she had thought long dead. No! It was a raw, broken croak, rusty from years of disuse, but it was a word. It was her voice. The sound shocked everyone into silence, none more so than Lucian. His head snapped up, his golden eyes blazing with killer instinct, locking onto hers. The fury in them faltered, replaced by sheer, stunned disbelief. That single moment of distraction was all the mad wolf needed. It bucked violently, throwing Lucian off balance and sinking its teeth deep into his shoulder. Lucian roared in pain and rage, a sound that was no longer human. He threw the wolf off him, and as he rose to his feet, Arwen saw the change. His eyes were no longer gold. They were glowing, molten suns. His features sharpened, his teeth elongating into fangs. His wolf was on the surface, screaming for blood. His blood. The blood of the one who had harmed what was his. Time shattered. The world dissolved into a tableau of primal violence, stark and terrifying under the cold gray sky. The Alpha King, bleeding and enraged, rose from the cobblestones, his body caught in the violent throes of a half-shift. He was a creature of nightmare, caught between man and beast, his roar of agony and fury echoing off the stone walls. His golden eyes burned with the light of a feral sun, and the air around him crackled with a power so immense it was a physical pressure, forcing the breath from Arwen's lungs. The wolf Kale, blood dripping from its jaws, crouched low, its madness momentarily overshadowed by the instinctual terror of facing a true alpha's wrath. The other warriors were frozen, trapped between their duty to intervene and the soul-deep certainty that to do so would be suicide. But Arwen was no longer frozen. The single broken word she had uttered had shattered a dam within her. For 20 years, her voice had been a prisoner in her own throat. Locked away by trauma and fear, now seeing Lucian wounded, for her it had broken free. And with it came a terrifying, reckless courage she didn't know she possessed. She ran, her feet clad in the soft leather slippers, were silent on the stones as she moved from the shelter of the garden into the heart of the chaos. She didn't run away. She ran toward him. Lucian, her voice was stronger this time, still rough and unfamiliar, but clear and sharp. It cut through the cacophony of snarls and shouts. His name, spoken by her, was an anchor in the storm of his rage. He turned his head, his burning gaze pinning her. The beast in his eyes warred with the man. He saw her, not as the Omega, not as the captive, but as the woman who had just called his name, who was running into the danger, not from it. She didn't stop until she was standing between him and the rabid wolf. She planted her feet, a small, fragile human shield against a tidal wave of violence, and held up a trembling hand. She was facing the mad wolf, but her plea was for the king behind her. "Stop," she croaked, her voice shaking but resolute. "Please, don't kill him." The mad wolf, Kale, saw only an obstacle, a weak, wolfless female daring to stand in its path. With a guttural snarl, it gathered its powerful haunches to spring, to tear through her to get to the Alpha. But Lucian's voice boomed from behind her, a sound of pure, absolute command that vibrated in her bones. Down! It was not a word. It was a physical force. The wolf Kale whimpered, its lunge aborted, and its body slammed onto the cobblestones as if struck by a giant, invisible fist. It lay there, panting and trembling, the madness still in its eyes, but its body held in thrall by the sheer, overwhelming power of its alpha's will. The courtyard was suddenly, deathly silent. The only sounds were the ragged panting of the subdued wolf and the harsh, pained breaths of the king. Arwen slowly, tentatively turned to face him. The feral light was receding from his eyes, the sharp, wolfish cast of his features softening back into the man. But the effort it cost him was immense. His body was rigid with control, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Blood streamed from the deep bite on his shoulder, a shocking river of crimson against the dark fabric of his tunic. His gaze was fixed on her, a maelstrom of emotions swirling in their golden depths, fury, pain, disbelief, and something else. something that looked terrifyingly like awe. "You spoke," he rasped, his voice rough with pain and shock. Arwen could only nod, her own throat tight with a combination of fear and the unfamiliar strain of using her voice. She took a hesitant step toward him, her eyes locked on the bleeding wound. The sight of it, of his blood shed to protect her, sent a sharp, painful pang through her chest. "You're hurt," she whispered, the words clumsy on her tongue. His beta, the tall warrior with the serious face she had seen on the beach, finally broke his paralysis and rushed forward, a strip of clean linen in his hand. "Alpha, let me see to it." Lucian waved him away with a sharp gesture, his eyes never leaving Arwen's. He seemed to be seeing her for the first time. The fragile, silent creature he had plucked from the sky had just found her voice to command him, had placed her body in the path of a rabid wolf to save the life of one of his own. She was not what he thought she was. She was more. "The wolf," Arwen said, forcing the words out. "The sickness, is there a cure?" She remembered the garden, the herbs of healing and of poison. Lucian's gaze flickered to the trembling animal on the ground. A muscle in his jaw twitched. The beast within him still wanted a kill. "Sometimes," he said, his voice tight, "if the madness hasn't taken root too deep, it requires a rare flower, moon petal, that grows only in the high caves, and a binding ritual. It is dangerous. It often fails. But you have to try," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "He's one of yours. You said they were your responsibility." She was throwing his own words back at him, a breathtakingly audacious act for a captive. Lucian stared at her for a long, unblinking moment. The entire pack held its breath, watching the silent battle of wills between their wounded, furious king and the strange, voiceless woman who had suddenly become their queen's advocate. Finally, with a slow, deliberate nod, he relented. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. He turned to his beta. "Kian, take Corbin's pup to the healing chambers. Chain him, send riders for his father, and send a party to the high caves for Moonpetal. Now." "Alpha," Kian said, bowing his head in deference. He and two other warriors carefully approached the subdued wolf, throwing a heavy net over it before dragging it away. The crisis for the moment was over. Lucian turned his attention back to Arwen. He took a step toward her, and she flinched, the sheer, dangerous power still rolling off him in waves. The scent of his blood was thick in the air, a primal perfume that was both terrifying and strangely alluring. His expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something akin to concern. "He did not touch you?" She shook her head, unable to speak again. Her throat felt raw, her body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. "Good," he breathed. He raised a hand as if to touch her face, but stopped, his fingers hovering in the air between them. He seemed to realize his hand was covered in his own blood. He let it drop to his side. "Come, Elspeth will tend to this." He turned and began walking back toward the main keep, his stride slightly unsteady. Arwen followed, her mind a chaotic storm. She had spoken. After a lifetime of silence, she had found her voice to save a life, to stop a king. And in doing so, she had tied herself to him in a way that was deeper and more frightening than his simple claim of ownership. She had acted as his conscience. She had acted as his partner. She had acted in front of his entire pack as his queen. He led her not to her chambers, but to his own. It was a Spartan, masculine space, dominated by a huge, unadorned bed and a massive table covered in maps and strategic markers. The old woman, Elspeth, was there, her face a stony mask, but her sharp eyes were wide with alarm at the sight of her king's bloody shoulder. Lucian sat heavily in a large carved chair, hissing in pain as the movement pulled at the wound. Elspeth was immediately at his side, her movements swift and efficient. With a small, sharp knife, she cut away the torn, blood-soaked fabric of his tunic, exposing the injury. Arwen's breath caught in her throat. The bite was deep, a savage crescent of torn flesh and muscle. It was a grievous wound, one that would have killed a lesser man, but it was not the only mark on his body. His torso and arms were a tapestry of old scars, a history of his life written on his skin. There were the thin, silvery lines of blades, the puckered circles of old arrow wounds, and the jagged, raised scars of claw and fang, each one a testament to a battle fought, a challenge met, a throne defended. Elspeth worked in her disciplined silence, cleaning the wound with practiced hands. Arwen stood by the door, feeling useless, intrusive. She wanted to run back to the safety of her room, to the silence she knew, but she couldn't. Her legs would not move. She could not look away from him, from the evidence of his pain, a pain he had taken for her. Lucian's head was bowed, his dark hair falling forward as he endured Elspeth's ministrations. But he was not looking at his wound. He was watching Arwen from under his lashes, his golden eyes intense and questioning. He was waiting. Elspeth finished cleaning the wound and began to bind it with clean linen bandages. As she worked, she glanced at Arwen, then back at her king. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped back from Lucian, leaving the bandage half-tied. She looked directly at Arwen and gave a small, sharp nod toward the king. An invitation, a test. The meaning was clear. This is your place now. Finish it. Arwen's heart leaped into her throat. Her? Tend to the Alpha King? It was unthinkable. But Elspeth's slate-gray eyes were insistent. And Lucian was still watching her, his expression unreadable, waiting to see what she would do. Her hands were trembling. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to flee. But her feet, seeming to have a will of their own, carried her forward. She knelt before his chair, just as he had knelt before her the night he'd tended her own small cut. She took the ends of the linen bandage from Elspeth. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking so badly she could barely hold the cloth. The skin of his shoulder was hot beneath her touch, radiating a feverish heat. His scent filled her senses, a dizzying mix of storm, forest, and the sharp metallic tang of his blood. She focused on the task, her entire world shrinking to the space of the wound, the white linen, and the heat of his skin. She pulled the bandage taut, her touch growing more confident as she worked. He did not flinch, did not move a muscle, but she could feel the tension in his body, the tight control he was exerting over his own pain. She finished the knot, her fingers brushing against the unblemished, scarred skin of his chest. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity through her, so powerful it made her gasp. She looked up and his face was inches from hers. The golden inferno in his eyes was back. But it was not the rage of the beast. It was something else, something deeper, hotter, and infinitely more dangerous. Arwen, he whispered, his voice a low, rough caress, and then he leaned forward, closing the small distance between them. He did not claim her lips. Instead, he gently, deliberately pressed his forehead against hers. It was not a kiss, it was something more profound. A meeting of minds, of souls, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had just been forged between them in the crucible of blood and violence. In that moment, with his breath on her skin, and his pain a living thing beneath her hands, Arwen knew she was lost. She had not only fallen from a cliff, she was falling for the king who had caught her. The touch of his forehead against hers was a brand of a different kind. It seared through her fear, through her defiance, and marked her in a way the Blackwood sigil never could. This was not a mark of ownership imposed by force, but a connection acknowledged, a bond sealed in the silent language of shared breath and mutual survival. His scent, a potent mix of blood, sweat, and the primal essence of his power, was no longer just a threat. It was a territory she found herself wanting to claim as her own. He pulled back slowly, the space between them suddenly feeling like a chasm. His golden eyes, softened by pain and a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen in him before, held hers. He didn't need to speak the words. She could feel them vibrating in the air. You are mine, and I am yours. The thought was so terrifying, liberating, it made her dizzy. Elspeth, her duty done, her test administered, gave a single curt nod and slipped from the room as silently as a shadow, leaving them alone in the charged intimacy of the king's chambers. Your voice, Lucian said, his own voice a low, rough murmur. I did not know. Arwen found her own voice, still a fragile, hesitant thing. Neither did I. She looked down at her hands, which were resting on her knees, still tingling from the memory of his skin. I haven't, since my mother died. The raiders who killed her, they... She couldn't finish the sentence. The memory was a black hole in her past, a place of screams and fire and the sudden, shocking silence that had followed. Lucian's hand, the one not bound to his chest, covered hers. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutal power she knew he possessed. You do not need to speak of it. He understood. He did not need the details of her trauma to recognize its weight. He simply accepted it, as he accepted her scars, her silence, her wolflessness. He accepted all of her. The realization was a quiet explosion in her chest. For her entire life, she had been defined by what she lacked: a voice, a wolf, a place. To Lucian, those were not deficits. They were simply parts of her story, the story of the survivor he had named Altan. The days that followed were a strange dream. Arwen was no longer confined to her room. She had the freedom of the fortress, a freedom that was both a gift and a constant reminder of her gilded cage. But the way the pack treated her had changed. The suspicious glances were replaced with looks of grudging respect, even awe. She was no longer just the king's strange captive. She was the woman who had faced down a rabid wolf, who had found her voice to calm the Alpha's fury. They didn't know what to make of her, this silent Omega, who seemed to wield a quiet power over their formidable king. They gave her a wide berth, but their growls were no longer hostile. They were uncertain. She spent her time in the vast library, losing herself in books of history and lore, trying to understand the world she had fallen into. She learned of the Unification Wars, of how Lucian's father, a brutal and paranoid king, had ruled through fear, setting clan against clan. She read of Lucian's rebellion, of how he had fought his own uncle, his own kin, to seize the throne and forge a new, unified pack from the ashes of the old. His scar was not a mark of kinslaying, but a symbol of his sacrifice to end a bloody tyranny. She also found her voice. Slowly, tentatively, she began speaking to Elspeth, the two of them sharing a language of quiet, halting words and expressive gestures. The old woman, in her stern, silent way, became Arwen's confidant. She would bring Arwen special herbs for a soothing tea to help her raw throat and would listen, her slate-gray eyes missing nothing, as Arwen haltingly spoke of her life in the Blackwood Pack. Lucian was a constant, powerful presence. His shoulder healed with the supernatural speed of a true alpha, but he used the injury as an excuse to remain within the fortress. He would find her in the library, not speaking, but simply sitting in a chair across the room, watching her read, his presence a warm, protective weight. He would join her on the battlements, standing beside her in comfortable silence as they watched the sun set over his wild kingdom. He never touched her again with the intimacy he had shown in his chambers, but the connection between them was an undeniable living thing. It was in the way his eyes would find her across a crowded hall, in the way his scent seemed to cling to her clothes, in the way her own body now hummed with a constant awareness of his proximity. The empty space inside her, where her wolf should have been, ached with a strange, new longing. It was a hollow waiting to be filled by his presence, his power, his wolf. One evening, a week after the attack, Kian, his beta, sought her out in the library. His face was grim. "The she-wolf asks for you, Tahao," he said, his voice low and respectful. Arwen looked up from her book, confused. "She-wolf?" "Kale's mother," Kian clarified. "We saved the pup. The king's ritual worked. The moon sickness is broken, but he is weak. His mother, she wishes to thank you. She says you saved her son's life twice, once from the sickness and once from the Alpha's justice." A cold knot of fear formed in Arwen's stomach. To face one of them, to be thanked, it was a situation for which she had no precedent. "The king, does he know?" "He sent me," Kian replied. Lucian wanted this. He wanted his pack to see her, to accept her. He was weaving her into the fabric of his world, thread by thread. With a deep breath, Arwen closed her book and followed Kian to the healing chambers. The mother, a strong, handsome woman with kind eyes, wept as she embraced Arwen, holding her tight and murmuring her gratitude. Her son, the wolf Kale, now in his human form, a lanky, pale youth, stood behind her, his head bowed in shame. When his mother released her, he stepped forward and knelt, pressing his forehead to the stone floor before her. "I am not worthy of your forgiveness," he mumbled, "but I offer you my life. I am sworn to you, my lady. I would die for you." The title, my lady, shocked Arwen to her core. In front of the healers and the guards, one of the pack's own had just sworn a life oath to her, the outsider, the Omega. It was a public declaration of her new status, a status Lucian had orchestrated. As Keon escorted her back to her chambers, the truth of her situation settled over her with breathtaking clarity. Lucian wasn't just keeping her, he was elevating her. He was not making her his consort or his pet. He was making her his queen. That night, he came to her room. He did not knock. The door simply opened, and he was there, a silhouette against the torchlight of the hall. He had a darkness in his eyes she had not seen since the night on the beach, a hunger that was raw and barely restrained. "The Blackwood Alpha sent a rider," he said, his voice a low growl as he closed the door behind him. "He demands the return of his property. He says you are a deviant Omega who belongs to his pack, to be punished according to their laws." Arwen's blood ran cold. Marcus, Alpha Gregor, they hadn't forgotten. They wanted her back. "He offers me 3 leagues of forest along the southern border in exchange for you," Lucian continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "He thinks he can buy you back, like a stray hound." Lucian began to walk toward her, his movements slow, deliberate, predatory. The calm, controlled king was gone. This was the Alpha, the beast she had seen in the courtyard, and his fury was a palpable thing. "I sent the rider back with a message," he purred, his golden eyes beginning to glow with an inner fire. "I told him the woman he cast from a cliff was no longer his to claim. I told him that the sky-fallen queen of the Shadowlands now sits at my side." He was in front of her now, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. His touch was electric, possessive. "I have given you time, Arwen," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion that was deeper than anger. It was need, a primal, soul-deep need. "I have given you space. I have let you find your voice. I have shown you my pack, and I have shown them you. But my wolf, he will wait no longer." The air thickened, growing heavy with unspoken promises and ancient rites. The bond between them, the one his wolf had recognized the moment she fell, was straining at its leash, demanding to be made real. It was no longer a question of choice. It was a matter of destiny, of 2 halves of a whole finally coming together. "They marked you with shame," he growled, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Tonight I will mark you with my soul." He lowered his head, and his mouth claimed hers. It was not a gentle kiss, it was a cataclysm. A raw, desperate claiming that shattered the last of her reservations and set her soul on fire. His taste was of wildness and power, of storm and stone, and she met his ferocity with a desperate hunger of her own. Her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. The kiss broke, and they were both breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together. "There is only one way to make this claim absolute," he breathed against her lips, his eyes burning into hers. "To bind you to me, to my pack, so that no one can ever challenge your place here again, so that no one can ever try to take you from me." He pulled back just enough for her to see the change in him. His canines were elongating, his eyes blazing with molten gold. His wolf was on the surface, looking at her, at his mate. "The mating bite, Arwen," he murmured, his voice a guttural sound of pure possession. "It will forge our souls together. It will make you mine, in flesh and in spirit, for all eternity." He lowered his head, his lips tracing a path of fire from her jaw down the sensitive column of her neck, seeking the place where her pulse hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm. He was giving her a choice, but it was no choice at all. Her body arched toward him, a silent, willing offering. Her soul, which had been silent and empty for so long, screamed a single, resounding word: yes. The wind that swept across the high battlements was different now. A year had passed since the night of the blood moon, and the seasons had turned the world from a landscape of rust and ruin to one of vibrant, burgeoning life. This wind tasted of spring, of damp, thawing earth, sweet grass, and the promise of rain. It no longer screamed of endings and the abyss, but whispered of new beginnings. It played with the strands of Arwen's hair, no longer a frantic ghost, but a gentle caress. She stood at the parapet, her hands resting on the cold, ancient stone, and looked out over the vast, dark sea of the Shadowlands, her kingdom. The word still felt strange, a borrowed garment that was only just beginning to feel like her own skin, but it was truth. The ring on her finger, a simple band of hammered silver entwined with a single dark piece of obsidian, was a testament to that truth. The queen's ring. She raised her left hand, turning her wrist to the pale morning light. The brand was still there, a faint silvery memory beneath her skin. The ugly, twisted sigil that had once been the sum of her existence. It no longer held any power over her. It was just a scar, no different from the dozens that mapped the skin of her king. It was a reminder not of her shame, but of the choice she had made. The leap that should have been her end had been her genesis. A far more potent mark graced the curve of her neck and shoulder. She traced it with the fingers of her other hand. It was not a brand of scarred flesh, but a beautiful, intricate pattern of silver lines that shimmered just beneath her skin, visible only in certain light. Lucian's mark, the mating bite. It was a living thing, a conduit of feeling and thought that bound her to him more profoundly than any vow. It had not given her a wolf, but it had done something far more miraculous. It had filled the hollow, silent space inside her with the constant, steady thrum of his. She could feel him now, his presence a warm hum in her soul, even as he held counsel in the great hall 200 feet below. She felt his strength, his focus, and the deep, unwavering affection that was a constant baseline to his thoughts of her. A quiet footstep behind her made her smile. She didn't need to turn. "The patrol reports are in, my lady," a respectful young voice said. She turned to face Cale. The youth who had once tried to tear her throat out was now the captain of her personal guard, his devotion a fierce, burning thing. The moon sickness was a distant memory, but he served her as if in constant penance, a debt he felt he could never truly repay. "And?" she asked, her voice calm and clear. It was a sound she now wielded with quiet confidence, no longer a rusty, broken thing, but an instrument of her will. "All is quiet on the southern border," he reported, his gaze steady. "The Blackwood curs keep to their side of the river. They have not tried to cross since the Alpha King met them there last winter." Arwen's mind drifted back to that day. Alpha Gregor, flanked by a furious Marcus Thorn and 50 of his best warriors, had come to the border, demanding her return. Lucian had met them alone, with Arwen standing at his side, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. Gregor had roared and threatened, calling her property, a broken thing that had defied pack law. Lucian had not raised his voice. He had simply smiled, a cold, dangerous baring of teeth, and pulled back the collar of Arwen's cloak to reveal the shimmering silver mark on her neck. The sight of it had silenced the entire Blackwood delegation. It was a claim no one could dispute, an act of mating that elevated Arwen beyond their laws, beyond their reach. The power radiating from the mark, from the bond between Alpha King and his chosen mate, was a physical force that had made the very air tremble. Marcus, blinded by rage and humiliation, had made the fatal mistake of shifting, of launching himself across the shallow river in a desperate, foolish attack. Lucian hadn't even shifted fully. He had met the beta's charge, and with a single, contemptuous swipe of a clawed hand, had sent Marcus flying back to the far bank, broken and whimpering. Alpha Gregor had stared, not at his defeated beta, but at the utter calm on Lucian's face, and at the quiet, unshakable strength of the woman at his side. He had seen not a broken Omega, but a queen. And in that moment, he knew he was defeated. They had turned and slunk back into their woods, and the border had been quiet ever since. "Thank you, Cale," Arwen said, bringing herself back to the present. "You are dismissed." He bowed low, a fist to his heart, and retreated, his loyalty a tangible shield around her. Left alone once more, Arwen returned her gaze to the horizon. She had found her place here, not just as Lucian's mate, but as a force in her own right. She had no wolf, but she had a voice. She had no shifter's strength, but she had a human's empathy. She had taken over the Grove of Judgment, not as a place of punishment, but as a place of healing. The garden now flourished with medicinal herbs, and she had become the pack's healer, her quiet, gentle nature, a balm to the sick and the injured. They called her the Moon Queen, the quiet center to their Alpha King's storm. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar, intoxicating scent washed over her, chasing away the last of the chilling memories. Lucian. He pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. The bond between them flared, a warm, golden pulse of pure contentment. Council is a tedious affair without you by my side, he murmured, his deep voice a rumble against her back. My beta drones on about grain stores, and all my wolf can think about is the way the sun looks in your hair. She leaned back into him, her body fitting against his as if it were made for no other purpose. And what did you decide about the grain stores? I decided to come find my queen, he answered, pressing a kiss to her temple. He was silent for a moment, his arms tightening around her. A year ago, on a night much like this, a different moon was in the sky. The blood moon, she whispered. You chose to leap, he said, his voice soft, filled with the remembered awe of that moment. You chose death over chains. I have never seen such courage. Arwen turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw, her fingers tracing the faint silvery line of his scar. His golden eyes, so often filled with the burdens of a king, were now filled only with her. I didn't choose death, Lucian, she said, her voice clear and strong. I chose freedom. The fall was just the path I had to take to find it. He looked at her, at the woman who had once been a silent, broken Omega, now the confident, beloved queen of his vast and wild kingdom. He saw the survivor, he saw the sky-fallen star his wolf had recognized. He saw his mate, his equal, his heart. You fell, he whispered, leaning in to capture her lips in a kiss that was both tender and fiercely possessive. And I was lucky enough to be standing in your sky. She smiled against his mouth, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. She had leaped from a cliff to escape her fate, only to fall directly into the arms of her destiny. And as he held her there, high on the battlements of their home, with their kingdom stretching out before them, she knew that this life, this love, was not something that had simply happened to them. It was a choice they had made and would keep making every single day. It was the sky they had chosen together,